This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today, Eric Barker, creator of the blog Barking Up the Wrong Tree. He's all about science-based answers and expert insight on how to be awesome at life. Now, before you think that's trite or cliche, far from it. Awesome stuff about success and getting ahead. His newest work, Barking Up the Wrong Tree, the surprising science behind why everything you know about success is mostly wrong. A great book, great insights. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Eric Barker. So Eric, I think you made this book for me. At least that's my personal feeling as I'm reading, because everything that I've instinctively felt as someone who has been involved in commerce for 20 years, most of that time online, in fact, all of that time online, you just touch on all these instinctive issues that I've had about success or felt about success, things that I've perhaps experienced with lots of, scars on the back. But you are finding the science that backs up the intuition that I never, you go through life with nobody talks about what's in your book. They just don't talk about it. And I'm going to jump into an example in a second, but it's really fascinating that you've gone down this path. How did you become such a contrarian? How did you get outside the box yourself?
I think I started out pretty contrarian, but I've had a pretty unconventional career myself. My undergrad was in philosophy. I subsequently was a screenwriter in Hollywood for 10 years. Then I worked in video games, and I had a very unconventional career. I just kept finding that a lot of the maxims of success that you're told when you're a kid just really didn't seem to apply. And I wondered, they didn't apply to me, and I wondered how many other people felt the same way, be they in conventional or unconventional careers. Given that my blog for 8 years now, I've been looking at the research that underlies a lot of the questions we ask ourselves about getting ahead in life. I just really wanted to understand for myself and to share with others what are the real answers to these maxims of success, and kind of give these old saws the Mythbusters treatment.
Let's jump into one, which I just love. It's right there, standing for all of us to think about, which is the valedictorian, the number one person in high school or college. And I remember in high school, they hauled some gal out that I had never even seen. I guess, a woman that specialized in rote memorization, and they hauled her out to give some kind of a presentation for our high school commencement. I had no idea who it was. And, as a kid, I always just thought this rote memorization, just memorizing for the sake of memorizing, where the hell is the learning? And you've actually gone ahead and done a little bit more on the measurement of the success of valedictorians. And it's kind of funny that we still worship it, huh?
Karen Arnold did research at Boston College studying valedictorians, and what she found is that basically their strength is following the rules. School has very clear rules, very clear grading system. So those people valedictorians succeed because they're very good at rule compliance. But as we all know, life does not have clear, strict rules, and you have all kinds of exceptions, there's people skills, you have entrepreneurs, you have all kinds of scenarios whereby there are no strict rules in life. And so what you see when you track valedictorians after they graduate from high school is that they do quite well, but they don't shake up the system. They become part of the system. So the number of valedictorians become millionaires or become game changers isn't the case, because their personality is not such, that they go out and really shake things up. They kind of fit right into the system. And, we all have heard the stories. Steve Jobs dropped out of college. Bill Gates dropped out of college. these people who are more of the extremes, the outliers, are the ones who these are the ones who go to the extremes. They either become, horrible failures or tremendous successes. But, compliance with rules only gets you so far.
Here's the tough part where I see the direction that you've gone. I accept it 100%. I read your examples, I go through your work, and I'm just like, bingo, bingo, bingo. I mean, everything just resonates, not only because I just want to believe it, I've experienced many of these things. And I don't think most people would disagree. I think if people in the abstract were going through a class, for example, to explain what you have found, they would go, yeah, that makes sense. The kicker, though, is what percentage of people have gone so far down the path of being a part of the system, being a part of the matrix, sucking on that feeding tube, that they can't break away because it would cost too much in ego to break away. That's the real trick, isn't it?
Part of it comes down to fundamental personality issues as well, where some people just aren't comfortable, with some people's risk tolerance isn't high enough to want to go out and do something that dangerous and risk a huge failure in order to get the chance at a huge success. I mean, some people, it's really difficult for them to get in that mindset where they're going to break out and try something different, at least in a way that they would be comfortable with, because you have some people who can't, who just, because their personality can't seem to break the rules. And then you have some other people who, by their personality, can't seem to follow the rules.
If the environment was different, if the setup was different for the students, if they weren't told, hey, the meme is, get the best grades on the planet, you too can go to an Ivy League school. If that wasn't the scenario that was laid out and more of a risk-taking or entrepreneurial scenario was laid out, wouldn't we have a chance for better results?
Oh, undoubtedly, because I don't, it's not black and white. It's not, you don't have just polls of people who always break the rules or people who always follow the rules. There's that spectrum of gray in the middle. And I think we would have a lot more innovative kids who were trying new things and who weren't afraid to give things a shot or to find a balance, particular to themselves. Later in the book, I talk about, the issue of grit versus quit. And, we need to double down on our signature strengths, the things we're really good at, the things that are really meaningful to us. But by the same token, we need to take 5-10% of our time to keep trying new things to make sure that, we don't end up like the dinosaurs, that we're on the cutting edge and that we're constantly learning and growing. I think you're right in the sense that those kids in the middle should be given more of a chance as opposed to everybody being in this one-size-fits-all educational model.
Don't get nervous if I'm too opinionated about this subject. I just so happen to like your book a lot. I like where you went, so I'm going to be very passionate. And if you want to be the nice guy on the interview side, you can be the nice guy, and I'll just use the hammer and keep bashing people over this entire conversation.
I didn't realize this was a good cop, bad cop podcast, so we'll click nicely.
To expand this out inside your work too, you go into the topic of leadership. And you have the idea of leaders that kind of go through the system, and they're kind of, I guess, filtered through the system. Then you have the leaders that just kind of come in through the window. What I'm going to say next, I am no way making any kind of a partisanship type statement. But if you look at the most recent U.S. presidential election, I think it's and this doesn't talk about their leadership qualities. It kind of talks about the types of leaders they were. I think it's pretty safe to say that Clinton was kind of the filter coming through the system and Trump was kind of coming through the window.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. When you look at the research by Gautam Mukunda at Harvard Business School, he talks about those two types of leaders. The filtered leaders are the ones who have been thoroughly vetted by the system. And that's why some prior leadership research had shown that leaders don't make a huge difference, because once you've been thoroughly vetted, all of the resulting candidates are pretty similar because they've all run the same gauntlet versus your unfiltered leaders. So your entrepreneurs, your people who kind of do their own thing, they haven't been filtered by the system and they produce tremendous changes. Now, granted, sometimes those changes are bad, but also sometimes those changes are good and necessary to shake up the system. So once again, you have another example of people who sort of comply, who are part of the system, and people who are outside the system, and both have something to bring. You need filtered leaders to keep a system stable, to keep things running, and you need unfiltered leaders to really produce meaningful change. If you look at the election of Abraham Lincoln, he was very much, it was a perfect storm of events that got him to the presidency. That was what produced the end of slavery. We always there's times for filtered, there's time for unfiltered leaders, there's times for people who are compliant, there's times for people who bring change.
I think that was too politically correct. I just want to go, not because I'm trying to pick a partisan side. It could have been a Democratic unfiltered candidate. It's the unfiltered side. I mean, isn't there something, you kind of hinted this though too, but for everyone at some point in time in their life to try and get into that headspace of unfiltered, there's a reward on the other side of unfiltered that you can't just learn about. You do have to take that jump at some stage of the game to find this possibility, to find this feeling. And if you can get there, it's quite amazing. And I feel like I'm on my soapbox here, but I just wish that traditional school could somehow or another get the idea of that feeling, that entrepreneurial feeling, that unfiltered feeling across to students. So many of them don't have to feel like, damn, the only thing I've got to do is memorize all of this and then I'm going to be successful because then I'm going to, quote, get a job.
It's a fundamental issue about education is, basically is do what you're told. We know that loosens up obviously somewhat in college, where you can pick your major, you can pick your classes. You don't have to go to most of your classes, and you have more you have options for independent study. So it does loosen up somewhat as you move up the higher education ladder. But no, most of school is really about, follow the rules, do what you're told. Yeah, I think we definitely need to loosen up a little bit that model at least and give kids an opportunity, because I think it's Sir Ken Robinson who talks about where we're just kind of beating the creativity out of kids.
I look at a lot of the brilliant names that are across your work, behavioral pros, scientists, etc. And I think about myself, I'm just kind of one bit player. You're another bit player out there. Are we all just outsiders? Is anyone going to really pay attention to us, including all the brilliant men and women that you have in your book that have done the historic lifting? I mean, is the system that is in front of us that we all want to see have some change, is it impenetrable?
I would totally disagree. I think that, this is a better time than ever. I mean, basically the internet has given, the chance for ideas to spread. Now, granted, that we also now have a flood of ideas competing with one another. But basically, I mean, Gutenberg would be happy. We all now have our own printing press. Ubiquitous free distribution of our ideas. I certainly think there are challenges, marketing challenges, just in terms of getting people's attention. The war for attention now is before it was the war for distribution. Now it's the war for attention. I think, no, we can produce meaningful change. I mean, we're seeing niches everywhere. We're seeing small groups, distributed all around the world. So no, I have great hope in terms of getting ideas across and producing meaningful collective action.
I saw this name in your work, a really interesting guy, and I've happened to have seen him in a documentary, Jodorowsky's Dune. H.R. Giger, he was the guy that basically, for people thinking about movies, the aliens in Alien, that was all his work. And what I love about what he says, and I think this kind of dovetails into where I've been going so far in this conversation, is that there is discrimination, so to speak, against the term artist. And I love what Giger says, and you quote him. He says, in Switzerland, the word artist is a term of abuse, combining drunkard, whoremonger, layabout, and simpleton into one. And again, as I said, I saw him for the first time in Jodorowsky's Dune, and Jodorowsky was responsible for bringing him ultimately to Ridley Scott and Alien. I just love that, though, because that really, again, it's what we're up against for creative people. What are you up against? For trying to understand what's truly the way to go about success. The fact that so much of his society could make that much fun of the creative type, the artist. It's a challenge.
No, it's going to be a huge challenge because Again, the society wants stability. People who threaten that stability, either by ideas, by doing different things. Societies don't know what they need. There's always a pull towards stasis as opposed to entropy. You look at this and you see this across the board in terms of teachers in elementary schools and high schools always love to say that we love creative children, but the research shows they hate creative children because creative children don't follow the rules. Creative children don't do what they're told. They don't sit still. And you see the same thing right up the corporate ladder where, higher scores on creativity, those people are less likely to be CEO. And I think we've all experienced that to a degree where you see these job descriptions where they always want, we want creative people. Yeah, we want you creative people as long as you don't change anything. And so, and there is this tremendous irony there, and it exists all up the ladder. It's a challenge because people who want to do things. I mean, now granted, today's era, it's easier than ever to start your own company, to be a freelancer, to do your own thing. But no, there's consistent discrimination in society against people who rock the boat.
There's a ton of topics. We can only kind of sketch out some pieces today to kind of whet people's appetite. I highly recommend where you've gone with your work, Barking Up the Wrong Tree. You talk about some research from kind of shifting you away from where we've gone so far, and I'll come back. But you've got up some research that you talk about with Dan Ariely, a professor down at Duke, somebody who's actually appeared on this podcast. He's one of my first big non-trading guests. So always a shout out to Dan for that. But I thought was something really interesting that he talked about that I see that's pervasive in society today. He's talking about cheating and the idea that, when you see others cheat, it kind of becomes okay. If you and then cheating kind of goes up. I'm not just talking about school. I'm talking about all aspects of life, cutting the corner. If you see somebody else cut the corner, it becomes acceptable. In the last 5 years, I've probably seen a handful of entrepreneurs who seem to have business models built on cheating. By the time you as a customer figure it all out, they don't care. They've burned through you. They took some money. They've moved on. And I've also seen other people that are not yet at the level of these cheaters admire the cheaters. And I look at the whole thing and I'm like, what are you guys thinking? Are you thinking ahead at all? What are you going to be left holding in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? Nothing, because no one's going to have a damn good thing to say about you.
I mean, in the end, human beings are social creatures. I mean, social influence predates formal laws by, God, who knows, tens, hundreds, millions of years. So in the end, we're always, more influenced by those around us than by any kind of formal rules. And, we consistently, there's an old saying, I think, when it comes to ethics, there are three categories: ethical, unethical, and everybody does it. I think you see that consistently where, the speed limit's 65. If a cop pulled you over for 66, your likely reaction would be, seriously? Now, what's the rule? The rule is over 65 is a violation of the law, period. But, we all realize there's flexibility in there. That's how everybody does it. And we have to be careful because that can become a slippery slope where, we do start cheating. The issue is that along with the elements of creativity you see in creative people, you also see some negative traits as well because you push rule breaking too far and, suddenly you're a criminal. So it's a spectrum where sometimes we need innovation. There were, for how long were there terrible things like miscegenation was illegal? Anybody who did that or opposed that would have been breaking the law. But we now realize that we had our ethics screwed up. There's this tricky balance where being creative, wanting to do something different, sometimes it goes too far, but sometimes it's just what we need. So it's really tricky. You want to have somebody who's trying new things, but it's hard. But I think Dan Ariely's research on cheating is really fascinating and critical to see just how it affects us, because that's the key thing, is I don't think we're aware of it.
It almost reminds me of market bubbles in the sense that the mimicking of each other and the copying of each other's behaviors, whether it's it's a good behavior or a bad behavior, there's still that human social kind of copying, so to speak. And in this same vein, you cite some research from a Stanford professor, Bob Sutton. And what I love about the quote that you quote him, and he says, when you take a job Take a long look at the people you're going to be working with, because the odds are you're going to become like them. They're not going to become like you. You can't change them. If you don't want to become them, it's not going to work. And that expands out beyond the workplace, extends to relationships. And there's, it's when you think about it like that, if a young person, you say, gosh, do you want the chance of being your own, do you want to have your own soul, so to speak, your own creative legacy left behind? Well, if you do, that's one choice. But when you join the operation, whatever that operation might be, if that's the other choice on the plate, you're going to become that operation. You're not going to change that group.
We really do ourselves a disservice by only talking about peer pressure when it comes to kids and teenagers, because peer pressure affects us all throughout our entire lives. We all succumb to the pressures of context. Context is one of the most powerful. Actually, it was Dan Ariely when I was talking to him. If we've learned anything from the past few decades of social science research, it's about the power and importance of context. But again, just like the cheating issue, we don't think about it. Everybody loves to think, I'm my own independent thinker. I make all my own decisions. I'm objective. I'm not going to be influenced by. Yes, you are. Everything around you affects you to some degree, whether you realize it or not. I mean, if nothing else, where is your attention? What are you paying attention to versus what are you ignoring? But there's all kinds of subtle influences. And when we do have choices, sometimes we don't, maybe the household you grow up in. But when you're talking about career, when you're talking about workplaces, when you're talking about the people you choose to spend time with, they will exert tremendous unconscious influence in terms of your preferences, what you do. And we generally aren't fully aware of just how powerful that is. And we do have it in our power to choose who we spend our time with, because, like Bob said, you're going to become more like them. They're not going to become like you. That peer pressure aspect will affect us throughout our entire life. There's going to be peer pressure in that nursing home. There's going to be peer pressure everywhere. To be aware of it at least allows us to deal with it.
You mentioned at the top, screenwriter, 10 years, Hollywood. What is some of the raw material, the grist that came out of that experience that made it into this book? What are some of the things how did that particular gig shape you? Because I can only imagine we could probably talk a very, very long time about what you have seen behind closed doors in LA. LA is an interesting place, to say the least.
For me, skill-wise, I tell a number of stories to help illustrate the research that, having worked for Disney and Fox, and just being able to tell stories effectively, that helped. The other critical issue is because movies are in real time, as opposed to you pick up a book, you put a book down, you pick it up again. It's not meant to be read in one sitting. You can go back and reread a paragraph. Whereas movies, an hour and a half is an hour and a half. It moves in real time. So structure is critical. In anything that is in real time, structure is critical because you want to keep people engaged, and they can't easily affect the progression of events. So how you structure things to make it engaging, to keep it interesting, what happens before what becomes critical.
Was there anybody on the story front that really influenced you? And is there any example that you could share? So as you learn the craft of storytelling, is there anyone that you can relay an experience or how you crossed a threshold to become better at it? Don't you just love these questions you're not prepared for, right?
Oh, hey, they definitely keep things interesting. I got an MFA at UCLA Film School. My mentor was Howard Suber. Howard's an amazing teacher. I've learned so much from him. I think really, again, the critical thing I learned from him is in terms of, structure, that, beginning, middle, and end. It's really important, and we kind of take it for granted. One of the key things that I've taken away there is that in storytelling, there should be an emphasis on the word but, not and. Because when you tell stories, and I say, I went to the store, and I bought a soda, and I walked down the street, and I went home, that's not very interesting. You want to be turning the story. You want to be shifting the story. You want to have conflict, and that's produced by but, because but is by nature is talking about exceptions. So I went to the store, but it was being robbed. But I had ninja superpowers, but they weren't working that day. So there just kept being exceptions as opposed to a meaningless progression of events. You're producing change, and changes are interesting. So a story that takes advantage and leverages, the word "but" will keep moving, keep surprising the reader or listener, whereas "and" is just a procession of facts, and frankly, that's not interesting to anybody.
As somebody who's put out 5 books, written 5 books, I am extremely happy to get a very practical piece of advice. I mean, your book is fabulous, but I love that little one right there. I think everyone that's listening to this podcast will remember that one for sure. Skip the and go to but. Let me shift into a topic that I love because I've had my share of it, which is failure. But I don't view failure in the way, I kind of view failure like a baseball player going to bat. If you bat 300, you're doing pretty damn good. That means if you're only getting 3 hits out of 10, you're doing good. But 3 hits out of 10 doing good is not how failure is taught across almost all societies. In fact, many societies, probably worse than America, failure can be something much more traumatic. In fact, I spent a lot of time in Asia, and failure there is I think a lot worse than perhaps even in the States. But failure ultimately is a great learning experience, and if one can allow the failure to be kind of strategic and not let it overtake you, know that it's going to come, you're just got so many advantages, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, that's something we don't really think about. And Peter Sims wrote an excellent book called Little Bets, and he talks about how being innovative, trying new things, and of course that means, there's a big risk of failure there, is how so many innovative, creative, and later on successful and valuable things are created in life. Everything from, how stand-up comedians test jokes and then pick the best ones, to venture capital firms, to just trying out, new things in your personal life and, in your career or your hobbies. That's where new opportunities spring from. And I kind of pose that within the grit, quit continuum because, right now, grit is such a buzzword and for good reason, because a lot of people do struggle with being consistent and persistent, with things over a long period. But we can't take it too far and turn it into, you always need to be persistent. Because if we were totally persistent and never changed, then I'd still be, playing with, Star Wars figures, like I was when I was 5. You need some change. You need to mix things up. That means failure. You're going to be trying things. And like you said, you've got baseball. Hey, 30% is fantastic. If you look at venture capital firms, again, if you invest in 10 companies, 7 are probably going to fail, 2 might break even, and hopefully 1 will be the next Google. And those numbers can work. If you're smart about being relatively low investment up front, but with a high potential upside, if you structure things like that and make it a little bet with a potentially big payoff, we kind of have this thing where just failure is failure and failure is bad and it affects our self-esteem. And so we don't want it, as opposed to, treating it like a game, not taking it that seriously. It's a little bet, but it might have a big payoff.
It's a learning experience, right?
Well, that's where you learn from. How much you're going to learn is if you do something, you do it the same way every time, you're not going to grow until you get a punch in the face and life corrects you. There's only so much you're really going to learn. And that's, when all the research on 10,000 hours and deliberate practice, the element that gets underemphasized, if not mentioned at all, is that yes, 10,000 hours leads to expertise, but it's 10,000 hours of pushing your boundaries. I've probably washed my hair for 10,000 hours. I've certainly driven a car for 10,000 hours. I don't think I would qualify for NASCAR, because I wasn't pushing my skill level. I wasn't trying new things. I didn't have a certain amount of failure tolerance where I said, hey, you know what? If I get into a 14-car collision, that happens every now and then. I mean, you have to have a certain level of risk tolerance to be pushing the boundaries for those 10,000 hours to actually lead to expertise. Otherwise, it's not expertise, it's redundancy.
So the grit or quit mindset, where it's 2 different mindsets, but I'm thinking here, and I was just jotting down some names, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Uber, Mark Cuban's early ventures. These are all great examples of people that quit a particular venture, but then there was the grit in place to learn from it and move to something else. You could probably think of other names that, I mean, probably more than me, and rattle them off really quick. But there's a real, sometimes we forget when we see the success headlights and the 35-year-old entrepreneur, and damn, I'm always excited to see someone who's made $1 billion at 35. But sometimes there's a lot going on behind the scenes that you don't necessarily see.
And the truth is, we probably don't want to see it. There's a great quote from Michelangelo where he said, "If people knew how hard I worked, my achievements wouldn't be as impressive." We love to read about the 35 or 25-year-old billionaire because it feels like a magic bullet, because it feels like a lottery ticket. It feels like you wouldn't have to do anything. So, when there is less grit, it's this more achievable, accessible, dreamlike story. But like you said, with so many of these entrepreneurs, they've tried different things, they've failed, they've tried again, or companies have pivoted. I mean, Google originally started as a library indexing system. It's like that would not have been the influential powerhouse that Google is now, that billions of people around the world use to find every kind of information. But it's far sexy to talk about all the failure and all the upsets. We need to hear about that, because I think too many people give something a shot. They take a blow to their self-esteem, and then they quit. And the truth is that if you look at it like a game, and that's what a lot of the research shows, and also when I've interviewed specific people in the areas, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Special Forces, all look at their training as a game. It takes that pressure off. It doesn't affect your self-esteem. It can actually be fun. And for Navy SEALs, again, we're talking about some of the most rigorous vetting that exists. We need to be a little bit more lighter about it. We need to appreciate the benefits that come from failure. Now, obviously, you don't want to take it to the extreme of life or death, but we can structure that ahead of time. I think many of us are too scared because, like you said, society can really penalize us, stigmatize as failure.
Let me probe you a little bit on your Navy SEAL experience. Talk to me about how that went down. Some of the, perhaps the most eye-opening lesson that came from your interactions with SEALs.
What was really critical was the idea of optimism. Just with both in the research and with talking to Navy SEALs, you see that there is this belief that I can get through this. I can do this. One kind of emotional management technique you consistently hear from SEALs and other special operations people is kind of a narrow, kind of like a short-term focus. Because if you look at, I'm going to do this potentially maybe around 60 days of just hellish training, what they do is they kind of say, I just got to make it to lunch. I just got to make it to lunch. And they get to lunch, I just got to make it to dinner. I just got to make it to dinner. And they keep that kind of short-term focus, because otherwise if you say, I'm going to have to do this, I'm not going to get sleep, I'm barely getting any food, I have to do this for 60 days, that's overwhelming. But what I can do is I can get to lunch. And then I can get to dinner. They have that short-term focus that helps keep them optimistic. And in the research, you see similar things. Martin Seligman at University of Pennsylvania has shown that, what's really critical for keeping optimism, and by extension grit, is the 3 Ps, where things need to be, the issue of it being personal, persistent, and pervasive. When things feel personal, I suck, I'm terrible at this. When things feel persistent, this is always going to be awful, this is always going to be terrible. And pervasive, everywhere this is a problem. That produces pessimism, and people quit. Versus taking those 3 Ps and, having them be more positive, where, personal is to say, hey, it wasn't me, it was them, or it wasn't my day, that it's not persistent. Hey, I had a bad day. This is not always going to happen. Or pervasive, where it's like, I'm not so good in this area, but I'm great in other areas. That shift, that mental shift of the 3 Ps really helps produce optimism, and optimism produces grit. I've seen that among a number of special operations operators.
What's great about that story too is we think back to the beginning of our conversation where I was probing about schools and the hope that one day schools could perhaps bring a different curriculum and wake kids up in a different way. And what's, happy and sad is that we do have that inside of our systems. For example, the SEAL system, they're training. Clearly, they're learning this way of thinking in their training. Now, I'm sure somebody's sitting out there right now and they're saying, hey, Mike, Eric, we really don't want our kid to be trained killers. But that's not the point, you know? Let me shift you into an area that really struck me in your work, and that's the idea of mentorship. And I'll give a quick example. I have a new book that just came out. Somebody that I know who's been a mentor of mine took the book and used it in a response online to somebody that was asking him for an interview. And the person that asked for an interview was very curt, kind of rushy, give me a deadline. He's asking like this legendary trader for an interview, and he's really doing it in a dumb way. And the trader, the response was basically like, hey, I would prefer a more long-term beneficial relationship. This sounds a little too, I'm paraphrasing, a little too just not much depth here. I don't think this is really a good fit for me. And then he cited some of my stuff and kind of was hinting at the relationship that we have had. And I thought that was such a nice thing. And it wasn't something that I planned, because I met this individual in 2001. But I always remember how I handled it. Meeting somebody who was going to, I didn't really know who was going to be a mentor, but meeting somebody who ended up being a mentor so far ahead of me, I always did not ask for much. I just, what can I do? How can I help him? How can I help what he's interested in? And that's what I tried to do. And then in the long term, I look back after 15 years and you see, wow, the way that I played it, and I unfortunately did not have your book, so maybe I just got lucky. But the way that I played it worked out okay. But I think I've always had this feeling of like, hey, if you come in contact with somebody who is light years ahead of you, try and do something that can help them. And you really that might be the spark that lights that candle of a relationship that just goes on for the rest of your life. And you've seen this in the research.
That's been critical for me as well, where it's like with blogging, in terms of just putting stuff out there, that people appreciate, they're not being charged for it in any way. It creates an enormous amount of goodwill. And that's what you see in the research when you look at mentors is, many companies or organizations, schools will assign someone a mentor. And that's great, and that can be helpful, but those aren't the mentorships that really produce results when you look at the studies. The mentorships that really matter are the ones where the mentor cares about you and you care about them, because that's where you get which mentee is a mentor going to go out on a limb for? Somebody they really care about. And who are you going to feel disappointed if you fail or don't follow up? And who aren't you going to go the extra mile if there's somebody you want to make proud who's going out of their way for you? So that emotion, is really critical, and that's why it needs to be a personal relationship. And exactly what you're saying, where it's like, rather than something formal and structured, you want something organic that's friend-based, where you are thinking about them and how can I help them? What can I do for them? Because if it becomes too transactional, that's not where people really get emotionally are involved. They're motivated and they go out of their way to help each other. So like you're saying, that helping, that attitude that comes from being friends, that's what really makes a difference in mentor relationships.
Building on that though, too, that ultimately delivering something, if the mentor gives of their time and their energy, you're giving back your ultimate production, whatever you might do with that mentorship. If it shines nicely back on the mentor, then you start to really have a kind of a relationship that feeds on itself in a very good way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's something that a lot of people, what you're saying is something that a lot of people neglect, which that if done well, if you really do a great job with your mentor, and, then your mentor looks good. And let's not forget that when someone is a senior in a corporation or any organization, a very respected critical skill of senior level executives, CEOs, is being able to find and groom talent. That's not something that's easily evaluated on an employee review. For the people to be able to point and say, oh, you see those top leaders in the field? They were all students, of what's his name. That is a huge credential, and it's not a formal one. If people just point to it and they go, yep, they all learned from him. that's going to communicate to a board of directors or to senior management that this is the kind of person you want at the top spot or near the top spot, because they know how to get the most out of people, how to turn people into future leaders. It's a critical skill. If you can be part of bringing that to your mentor, you're doing them a tremendous service.
There's a through line in this conversation today, and I really see it as environment. And whatever environment one puts themselves into, we've used a lot of examples, and kind of all seems like it comes back to that key point of environment matters. And what you put yourself into, what your friends and family put themselves into, what your kids are put into, it matters. I mean, if your kids start, I mean, this is just such a simple example. If your kids start at a bad school with not the greatest other students, we're not going to have fantastic results. But you give a really simple example. It's kind of a fun one, which is the idea of a buffet. I mean, here I'm talking about these big picture things of, schools and stuff like that. Why don't you break it down and explain the buffet and how the buffet is organized affects us, doesn't it?
I mean, if you look at research done by Brian Wansink and also research done by Dan Ariely, it's just how it's structured. How close you sit to it, whether you're facing, how close the food is, whether you're facing the food. If you can, is the food can you see the food that you already finished? Oh, therefore I must be full. How much are your friends eating? All of these things are just subtle influences on your behavior. And so sculpting your environment becomes really, really critical to the degree that you are able. And of course, as you get older, as you move out of childhood, that does become much more controllable. And one of the key points that I make in the book is that, success has many different definitions for different people. But in the end, it's always about getting where you want to go, achieving your goals. Really a critical part of that, perhaps the most critical part of that, is figuring out, your signature strengths, the things you're naturally good at, the things you're naturally interested in, and aligning those with an environment that appreciates those and allows those to thrive. So, to go back to old sayings, first would be know thyself, and then second would be pick the right pond. Because, if you are a really fantastic accountant, perhaps going into the arts might not be a place where your strengths and your interests are going to apply. But if you are a fantastic accountant and you go to a top tier accounting firm, then you're going to be like a fish in water. It's going to be fantastic. And that's applicable, I think, through not only work, through our personal lives, where you have to understand who you are, what you're good at, what you want, and then making sure that your environment supports that and moves that forward. Because we've always, mom told you, don't hang out with those bad kids. And there's a really good amount of truth when you look at the academic research that mom was right.
I should tell the audience that not only will they enjoy the text, but if they're paying attention, hopefully they are, you're probably, how many more books are you going to force people to read from other pros that have brought so much great insight? I mean, really, you could just walk away from barking up the wrong tree and just immediately have 20 additional books on your Kindle tomorrow.
Believe me, one of the hardest parts of writing the book was the references section, because there's, what was it? I think it was Samuel Johnson said, a man will turn over half a library to write one book. And wow, I feel like I did. And there's so much great stuff out there. And I think a lot of people don't have the time to read all of it. Hopefully they will read some of the best of it or the stuff that's really interesting to them. But yeah, there's so much great stuff out there, and to try and pull it into one place and make it accessible, that was my goal. Hopefully I achieved it.
Barking up the wrong tree, the surprising science behind why everything you know about success is mostly wrong. Eric, where is the best place book will be available on all the typical places? Where is the best place for people to go to find out more about you? Because before you got into this book business, you've been fairly prolific already online.
If people Google my name, Eric Barker, or Barking Up the Wrong Tree, they can check out my blog. I've been blogging for 8 years. There's over thousands of posts on there, basically trying to make the academic research on a lot of these things about getting ahead in life, making it accessible, and interviews with experts, many of whom you have interviewed as well.
Well, I'm now gonna use your book as a guide for my next round of guests because no, I mean, but seriously, there's a lot in here that I know, but there's not quite a few names that I was not familiar with that are saying some really brilliant stuff. So it's like, I appreciate that. I appreciate you giving me the tip in the form of a book on where to go for my next 5 years of podcast.
Hey, I'm happy. I'm happy to hear that you've found a new and interesting use for the book. That's
right. I'm sure if Tim Ferriss and James Altucher see it, they'll also think the same thing. They'll both like, yeah, okay. So, listen, Eric, I appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you so much, Mike. It was great talking to you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.